Hi there, Biochemistry 1 students. This is the weeks 15 and 16 video, and I'll launch right in. This week, as you know, we covered these 2 weeks, we covered biogeochemical cycling. That means we're basically tracking FONC. You can see in the bottom right the molecules that living things are made of, and note that the elements carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus are the key elements for living things. I added for proteins, they do contain a little bit of sulfur. That is true. And the sulfur cycle would be like, if we were going to study a fifth one, that's the one we would do. But, to simplify things, we're going to think of FONC, the top 5 atoms, and the cycles that go with them. So we'll look at the carbon cycle, the water cycle, which covers both hydrogen and oxygen, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. We'll start with the water cycle as we did in class, right? I'm not going to go through all the steps because you have your drawing. We did go through that, and you can find any number of good ways of looking at the cycle and understanding it. Generally, we started in the ocean, evaporation occurred, condensation into clouds, precipitation. You can see that the image I have here has, some other familiar things going on land, like infiltration and percolation. But it also adds some new ones like surface flow in rivers and streams, and groundwater flow, sublimation when solid water turns directly to vapor, like basically when snow vaporizes, snow melt, snowpack. These are all things you could add. These cycles you can make very, very complicated if you want to, right? We could add in a dam here and talk about how it impedes surface flow. It stops surface flow. So you can kind of take these as far as you want. And at some point you have to ask, what are you trying to show? This, I think, is maybe even a little more than necessary in this image. Hence, I showed you a little bit less in my drawing in class, but this will work. I think this is good as a reference. If I'm just trying to give you a general sense of the water cycle. Note, I've also got the photosynthesis equation down there, that water is one of the 2 reactants there, and I did emphasize that. And to circle back to the beginning of the year, like when we studied the properties of water, using our toothpick activity, for example, we saw that water sticks together with itself because of hydrogen bonding. That's called cohesion. Water sticks to other stuff. That's called adhesion. Water absorbs a lot of heat without changing temperature very much, so it can moderate temperature. That's called having a high heat capacity. It has a low density when it's frozen, so ice floats in liquid. Mostly when things freeze, they sink in their own liquid. And then finally, it dissolves anything that has polar parts to it. And we studied that. If they have partial positives and partial negatives, or full positives, full negatives, then molecules will dissolve in water with those features. Okay. Now, if you were going to link this, for example, to, like, let's say we're looking at a forest ecosystem, we might be really interested in transpiration and plant uptake, right? That might be the part of the cycle that we want to zoom in on and really think about the rates of. If we were thinking about like getting water to farms in the Central Valley, we'd really want to think about precipitation in the Sierra Nevada, which is mostly going to mean snow, snowpack amounts, and then snowmelt runoff, the rate of snowmelt and runoff out of the mountains, and the rate of surface flow that results from that when the water enters streams and rivers. So depending on what we're trying to look at, we might focus in on different parts of the cycle. And as you're thinking about your drawings, I'm going to encourage you to do that with this and all cycles. Don't feel obligated to reproduce the whole thing. In fact, it's probably not very effective to do so. If you're drawing a forest, having evaporation out of the ocean is probably not going to be as important as having transpiration out of trees, right? And that's fairly obvious, actually. But I just want to free you all from the obligation to be completely thorough with every aspect of every cycle in the drawings that you're producing for the unit assessment. That is beyond unnecessary. And I'll just note that the molecules living things are made of, all of them depend on water, right? They all have H and O in them, and so they all depend on water. Final note, in photosynthesis, technically the O from water becomes part of oxygen. So if I actually look at the equation, right, the O that's in glucose, the O6 there, that all comes from CO2. The O that's in oxygen, O2 in the products, comes from water. So technically water is really only contributing H to living things. The O comes from CO2. Okay. Second simplest cycle. So I'm going in a different order here. The other cycle where we don't really change form, we just change location. So phosphorus is always in the form of phosphate, which is PO4 3 minus. It is generally found in what are called phosphate rocks. So you can see that on the bottom right of this image. Erosion may expose it. You can see that on the left-hand side. And if erosion exposes it, or if a human goes in and mines for it, it can be used as fertilizer, whether naturally, adding a little bit of fertility to soils or to freshwater or marine environments, or it could be used as like an additive on farms, for example, by humans, basically as a fertilizer that is more artificial, that's been mined out and added by humans. Either way, the plants that grow in those soils, or the algae and phytoplankton that grow in those freshwater or marine environments, will absorb the phosphorus. They'll use it to make their nucleic acids. You see that down here, DNA and RNA. And they will, pass that phosphorus around food chains. Animals that eat those plants, when they poop, their poop tends to be rich in phosphate, and that will enter soils, hopefully, and fertilize more plant growth in a cycle. If you over-fertilize a field, or if you put a bunch of animals into a very small area, like we tend to do with our cows when we put them on what are called feedlots, where we put them all into a tiny little area. If you've driven down I-5 toward LA, you've driven past these very stinky collections of cows that are called feedlots. There, the manure is not given the chance to fertilize soil. Instead, it simply piles up. And when it rains, it creates this like runoff that causes all kinds of problems downstream. Ideally, the feedlot is tasked with ensuring that that doesn't happen. They try to keep the manure in giant pools that are called manure lagoons, which sure sounds like a lot of fun to me. But at any rate, if it runs off, it creates a massive overgrowth of algae. You can kind of see that in the river mouth here. Too much runoff would cause that algal growth that you see in the river mouth to expand and become a harmful algal bloom. There'd be way too much algae, and it creates huge problems in the marine system. The way that phosphate likely re-enters rock is that it is either trapped in a soil that becomes rock, or it ends up in sediments at the bottom of the ocean. So it sinks to the ocean floor and gets trapped there. Either way, if the soils or the sediments get compacted into rock, you can end up with phosphate rock, where the phosphate, it remains trapped until erosion or a human mining it exposes it again. That, I think, is a pretty good summary of the phosphorus cycle. The nitrogen cycle. Here is a more complicated version of the nitrogen cycle than the one that I drew in class. Note that this still contains nitrogen fixation, which is this purple one here, super important, and I highlighted that for you. And they also show you N2 going into this factory and becoming chemical fertilizer, likely NH3, which they show you here. So whether it's fixed by bacteria or made in a factory by this process called the Haber-Bosch process, either way, the nitrogen becomes NH3, essentially, which is ammonia. That ammonia, if it's made by a bacterium, might fertilize a legume, for example, as we learned in class. If it's dumped on the field by a farmer in the form of chemical fertilizer, it might fertilize the growth of corn. Okay. Keep in mind, if it is chemical fertilizer, that form of chemical fertilizer, when it's directly dumped onto a field, is quite susceptible to washing away in water. So if it rains on the field, you should expect your runoff to contain a lot of nitrogen. The advantage of bacteria doing this is that bacteria don't wash away in the rainstorm at nearly the rate that NH3 would. And the NH3 is inside the bacteria, so they're not letting go of it. So nitrogen fixation isn't all equal. If bacteria are doing it, that prevents runoff from containing excess nitrogen, and it keeps the nitrogen in the soil so plants can use it. Whereas chemical fertilizer, you have to dump excessive amounts on. Plants will use a bunch of it, but a lot of it will run off as well and cause problems downstream, such as eutrophication, which is a word for what happens when there's a harmful algal bloom. You get a lot of dead fish and the development of what's called a dead zone, where there is no oxygen. The NH3 can, if it doesn't enter a plant through an indirect pathway, which involves this nitrification stuff, turning NH3 into nitrate through a series of intermediate steps. If it's not absorbed by a plant and incorporated into proteins, right, which I've noted down here, nitrogen is in proteins, so they're calling the form amino acids in this cycle picture. Those are the building blocks of proteins. So if it doesn't enter plants and become part of amino acids, one thing that could happen to it is it could be turned back to N2 or converted into NO3 and converted to N2O. These processes of denitrification, which produce N2O and N2, send soil nitrogen back into the atmosphere. N2 is mostly what the atmosphere is made of, as you know, just short of 80% of the air is N2. N2O is less familiar. This is nitrous oxide, and this is a greenhouse gas. So one reason why over-fertilizing a field can cause climate change is if you dump a lot of fertilizer onto a field, yes, the corn plants will take some of it, but also some of it will get nitrified and then denitrified into N2O, which goes into the air and contributes to climate change. And because we grow a lot of food and we use a lot of chemical fertilizer, actually, this is a driver of climate change that is pretty significant. Also, don't forget, the Haber-Bosch process, in order to produce chemical fertilizer, uses fossil fuels. And that's why out of this smokestack on the factory that's making fertilizer, you see CO2 coming out. Because when you burn fossil fuels, out comes CO2. So there are actually two ways in which chemical fertilizer causes or drives climate change, contributes to it. And that is both the burning of fossil fuels to produce the chemical fertilizer, and then the over-fertilization of fields that leads to denitrification into nitrous oxide. And boy, is that a lot to listen to, but if you can follow that, boy, good job. If nitrogen enters plants, also worth noting that it can enter food chains, just like with all the cycles, and animal waste, yes, indeed, does contain appreciable amounts of nitrogen. That's pretty much the nitrogen cycle. Worth noting that it's also necessary for nucleic acid synthesis, along with all of the FONC elements. And I'll move on to our final one, which is carbon, speaking of CO2. Here's a pretty complicated look at the carbon cycle. Again, a bit more than we looked at in our class. What I'll highlight for you here is that there are lots of places where photosynthesis is happening here. Like here it is on the right-hand side, kind of the way we drew it, going into a tree, becoming a carbohydrate. Here it is in the middle, entering a forest that's, growing. Here it is on the farm field, entering crops that are being grown. And also, of course, here it is diffusing into the ocean and dissolving and making carbonic acid. I'll just highlight for you a few things here. They add in that volcanoes emit carbon dioxide as well as carbon monoxide, which is CO. They highlight the limestone thing, marine sediments, which is basically limestone, calcium carbonate. Here it is in the middle, underneath the ocean along the coast, CaCO3. They include fossil fuels as well as decomposition in the soil and fossil fuel extraction and burning. Basically, this is what we drew, but with just a little bit extra. They also highlight that animal agriculture tends to produce methane emissions, which is CH4. You can see it coming from what looked to be like cows or something on the left-hand side. CH4 is methane, and that's also a greenhouse gas. Carbon is the backbone of all living systems. It's found in all living molecules, and it's found in a lot of different contexts in the environment too. So again, you see them here. Fossil fuels are carbon-based, as well as shells of marine creatures, as well as emissions from volcanoes and so forth. So I hope this quick run through the cycles and a few different images to look at is helpful. I'm not sure there's a whole lot I can add here because really what you all are working on in your assessment is better than anything I could say here. So what you're doing there is you're really doing a deep dive on like which parts of the cycle are critical to a certain process. And what you're realizing is that certain steps in the cycle are critical to some processes, but not as much to others. And so the cycles are kind of a global scale look at things. You do have to zoom in a little bit to look at an example in action. So I hope you're enjoying really applying those, thinking through how the chemistry of what's going on is related to the ecology, the ecosystem level processes, and getting to know how these cycles tie all that together. Thanks, everybody.